This is Justin Case of American Newscape, joining author of the fascinating book, Hoover's Nightmare, A Special Agent Gone Native, Wade Shirley, published by Fulton Books. Wade joins us today offering some insight into his intriguing book. Greetings, Wade. Welcome to American Newscape.
Well, hey, thank you, Justin. Glad to be here.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. Please get us started with sharing a glimpse at your recruitment into and your early years in the FBI.
Well, I'd like to say that as a child I always dreamed of being an FBI agent, but that just wouldn't be true. I was teaching school. It was in the late 1960s. I was pretty hungry because school teachers in Idaho didn't really make enough money to do justice to what the thing was all about. I felt that I was kind of in a rut. I felt like a phonograph back in those days, playing the same record over and over, just to a different class. And really that didn't meet my life goal. I always wanted to live a life that would make you or someone else jealous, and that wasn't happening teaching school at that time. And through a grapevine that the FBI was hiring. And I figured, I had a part-time job at the time teaching driver ed. And I figured FBI couldn't be any more dangerous than teaching driver's ed. So I took this great leap. I found the local office there in Idaho Falls. I took a leap of faith, I guess, is what it would amount to. I thought it was just like the old slogan when I decided later in life to run a marathon. It's not that I had the courage to finish the race, but I guess it's just I had the courage to start, because to take that leap, not knowing where you're going to live or not knowing which area of the country even that you're going to be in, it took, I guess I had to be a little bit desperate. Anyway, I did the testing, the interviews, the background, the fitness test, the psychological test, all of those things. And in October of '69, I entered duty with the FBI in Washington, D.C. And just for you history buffs, back in 1969, if you watched the show Forrest Gump, it showed one scene where he was there with the anti-Vietnam protesters. That was October '69. I was there just like Forrest. I don't know if I saw him in the crowd. Hard to tell anybody below all the whiskers and the long hair, but that was a real eye-opener. I guess that opened my eyes to the world of protests and the fact that things were a little different than they were in small-town Idaho. I entered a class with roughly 50 other agents, and we got involved in things like defensive tactics, firearms, endless, discussions or lectures on constitutional law, our jurisdiction, that sort of thing. It was just a parade of one professor or one agent, teacher after another coming in. And then, I always was asked back then, because Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI, the director. He had been there a long time, very controversial to some people. But everybody would ask me later, well, did you ever meet the man? And I guess my answer was no. And then the next question, why? Well, I had to go into a little bit of detail and tell them about why, what happened. I guess there was a class about 2 classes or so before our new agents class. And they were all lined up to go in and meet the man in his office, which was then in the Justice Building. And some newspaper guy, probably from the Washington Post, since they're pretty much anti-FBI, he had been trying to get an audience with the director, and he had not been able to get that. And so he saw his opportunity. He just jumped in line with all these guys with suits on. He straightened his tie and marched right in there. And when the director, and I guess he asked the director some question, and I guess he went ballistic. And he took it out on those 2 poor class counselors. Each class would have 2 nannies or class counselors with them. And I guess he solved it the way Hoover did. He said, no more, there will be no more embarrassment. No other new agent classes will come in and give that opportunity for someone to infiltrate the ranks. So that was me. I didn't meet the man. I didn't shake his hand, which is probably good, because he might have looked at me and said, oh, he's a pinhead, or he walks like a duck, or he's too short, all those other stories that we heard about what Hoover would say.
He,
But
so,
go ahead.
so Hoover wasn't the kindest of man at times.
Well, he was a dictator. His way was the way it went. Is his way or the highway, really. I could tell you story after story, but a lot of them are in the book that basically tells what kind of a individual he was. I guess at that point, the graduation time came. Our 3-month training was over, pretty much, and now was the part that we were all anxious about. Where are we going to move the family? Where are we going to live? And I was lucky. When I opened my envelope, it said San Antonio, Texas. And I thought, oh, hallelujah, praise the Lord, because I didn't want to go to New York. I didn't want to go to Detroit. All those places that you see on the news. I didn't want to go to any of those places. And San Antonio looked like a great office, and it turned out to be just such. I was to be there for 1 year as what they called a first office agent, a FOA. And I could give you endless stories there, but don't have time here. They're in the book. And probably the highlight of what happened in San Antonio, I met an individual that was probably the most famous guy in the Bureau. You ask around and nobody really had heard of. I call him Freddie McNichol, or Fast Freddie. Freddie was the kind of guy that everybody loved. He was charismatic, he was fun-loving, he knew a little bit about everything, he was smart. His daddy was an FBI agent back in Florida, and he was talented, so he had all the answers, and, sort of a magnetic type guy. But he also had a dark side, apparently. I was later to find out he pulled some things in San Antonio that we thought were funny. He wrecked a car once. It was his fault, and the Bureau held him liable. So he went down to the junkyard and got one of his informants, and since he had totaled the front end of his Bureau car, he got a car that had been totaled from the back end. They chopped the car in two, and he glued them back together. He welded them back together and presented the Bureau with a new car. But everybody in the office thought that was pretty funny. But anyway, the Bureau rewarded him later on because he apparently is down south, and he saved the life, apparently, of some special agent in charge. So they gave him, like a genie, they gave him one wish, and he said, well, hey, let me become a locksmith. Well, wouldn't every criminal mind want to be a locksmith? In fact, this guy got so good that he's world renowned. Many thought, a lot of people thought he was the best in the world at what he was doing. I had an agent friend just last week that read the book, and he said, hey, I went out on a special with this guy, and part of what he was to do was to crack a safe. He said he did it in less than 10 seconds. He said it was phenomenal. Most people couldn't do it if they had the code or the combination. He did it in 10 seconds. And so his job was it was a secret type at the time unit in the laboratory, and we referred to it by those that even heard about it as the black bag unit. They would break into places and place microphones, surveillance equipment that was court ordered, but they had to get in there and out without the bad guys knowing. So he was one of the best in putting bugs in. And but the problem with him is he went off the reservation, and I guess you just have to read about that in my chapter 5. He amazed people. I mean, he was so gutsy. They caught him breaking into and stealing money out of the bureau at the FBI Federal Credit Union, which was located in the Hoover Building. This guy was actually breaking in to the FBI Credit Union, and it's interesting how when he finally came down and was taken down and convicted, they found that he had hoodwinked up to 30 high-level Bureau officials. He had sold them new cars that were stolen, Porsches, diamonds. He was expert in, this guy was expert in a lot of different fields, and he used them all in his criminal endeavor. So, interesting story there. But you asked about what was one of my favorite stories of San Antonio, and that was it. And then off to Omaha. I guess transfer God smiled at me again, because Omaha was a great place. It again wasn't Chicago or New York City or San Francisco, any of those places. So two great transfers in a row, and I got there, and they asked me if I would like to go to this little one-man office out in the middle of nowhere that I had never heard of. So, hey, why not? And Scottsbluff, Nebraska became my next home for the next 20 years. Now, Scottsbluff, Nebraska was about as remote as any place you could ever find. It was located along the old Oregon Mormon Trail. You look out your window to the east, and there was a day's drive away by covered wagon, Chimney Rock, Scottsbluff National Monument, kind of guarded the valley there like a giant sentinel. It was on the North Platte River, beautiful farm country, but so remote, 452 miles away from my headquarters in Omaha, and I loved it. If you would probably back then, before I ever heard of Google, if you would have been able to Google the word remote, it would have probably given you Scottsbluff, Nebraska. Anyway,
did they recruit you to that office by saying, be your own boss?
The way it happened, I was transferred to Omaha. I'd been there just long enough to get my feet wet, about a week. And the boss called me into the office. He knew I was from out west in the old Butte division, which was Idaho and Montana. And he looked at me and said, how would you like to go about 450 miles closer to the promised land, son? Well, I said, well, hey, sign me up. That's a day's drive. I was a day's drive closer to my home in Idaho Falls. So away I went. Never seen the place before, and I couldn't have been happier after I got there and got acquainted with the good people there. But anyway, like I say, it was a one-man operation after a while. The old man was there retired. And I guess that gets me to the name of my book. J. Edgar Hoover, I said he was eccentric and kind of a dictatorial guy, but he also had a lot of phobias. He was afraid that his agents would become like maybe the local law enforcement. He called that going native. He didn't want his agents down at the coffee shop rubbing shoulders with the local cops, the sheriffs, the detectives, that sort of thing. So basically, he transferred his agents quite frequently back in those days. But somehow I got in under the radar. I made that my office of preference when I got to Scottsbluff. And literally, I became the agent that he basically feared. I became Hoover's nightmare because I totally went native. My best friends were the guys on all the departments. We worked together. We played together. We socialized. It was a great experience. And then it was on to Idaho after 20 years and another remote assignment in Idaho Falls. I was mostly alone there. And I guess, just for the record, both the Idaho Falls office and the Scottsbluff office, so they called them resident agencies. Both of them are now closed. They're not on the books of the FBI anymore. They've been archived. So I was really last of a breed in those one-man offices. And those doors are closed forever. And so that I guess is my brief synopsis of what we asked for there, Justin.
Well, you talk about North Platte. That was, that just wasn't out in the middle of the boonies. That was kind of a hot spot for a while, wasn't it?
Yeah. North Platte, the North Platte River ran through, and North Platte, the town of North Platte, it was my closest neighbor. There was a one-man office there at the time. He was 176 miles away. So, like I say, didn't get much help from there other than we could socialize on the telephone and compare horror stories. But a little later, I'll tell you kind of what happened in the area, and I think that might be what you're referring to as far as the hot spot. But,
what is okay? It sounds like you have a real talent for research and the ability to decipher history, and you had to, and I assume you had to in that profession.
I guess I've always loved history, and I guess I taught a little bit of it when I was teaching school prior to becoming an agent. But I love it, and I didn't want. I guess something that really kind of upsets me today. I was asked to speak to a college group down in Arizona, down in southern Arizona, by a good friend, and I had these incoming freshmen who were select students in a program that they had actually had to compete to get into. And in this group of 25 students, I asked them about J. Edgar Hoover, and there was not one kid, not one student in that class that pretended to even know who he was. I mean, I guess they thought he probably invented a vacuum cleaner or something. I thought, how sad that we let our history just disappear. And here I was out in the middle of nowhere, and I guess, in a way, Justin, I was making history, because no one will ever know about the things that I experienced out in western Nebraska. It was an era where a lot of things happened. And unless you read my book and realize what really happened and what I kind of told, what you couldn't read anywhere else, because there was nobody else to tell the story. I guess I realized at some point that I had somewhat of a moral obligation, maybe to preserve, to collect, to write about this era, the Indian Wars, and the things that took place there in the 1970s, particularly. And so I started collecting newspaper clippings things that pertained to my work, and I filled banker boxes full of this stuff, notes, assignment cards, things like that. And so basically, that's what Hoover's Nightmare is about. It's about history. It's about American history. It's about a part of the history that's so unique, nobody probably has heard about it unless you happen to be right there side by side with me. So, yeah, speaking of history, love it. I guess I'm fortunate, I feel fortunate to have been part of making some of American history.
Well, indeed, and feeling the obligation to preserve that, I think, is remarkable. But did you have any other motivations for becoming an author and writing this book? These days,
well,
being an author really doesn't put a lot of money in your pocket.
Yeah, I guess my hopes of being a millionaire, unless Hollywood gets away from the COVID thing and makes this into a series or something, I don't think it's going to happen. No, that wasn't my reason for writing the book at all, for monetary reasons. It was, I had experiences that I kind of was afraid would die with me if I'm getting older. And if you do the math, you'd probably say, this old geezer's getting up there. But I wanted my kids, my wife, my family, my friends, people that I know, I wanted them to, at least if they had the ambition to read the book, to know what happened there before it's flushed down the memory hole, because that's what happens. Our society is such that today's history is tomorrow's old news, and 3 weeks from now nobody even remembers it. So I started, I guess, and I guess that was my motivation. I loved reliving the book. When I was writing it, I thought those were exciting times, tragic times. Some of them were really difficult. And I guess I owe my wife, mainly my wife Beth, because every time I get sidetracked or get a little bit lazy, she'd kind of crack the whip on me, and she'd have me in there while she was doing her quilting. I was supposed to be in there writing the book, and we got it done. We got the book taken care of. So
you talk about being flushed down the memory hole. The idea that when we grew up, or the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, J. Edgar Hoover was one of the biggest personas in the world.
That's right.
And
right.
Just the idea that that part, his contribution or lack of contribution, is not taught, just mystifies me. But that is kind of the world we're in today.
Yeah, it is. They're trying to destroy history, Justin. I see statues going down. I'm not here to take sides and say this guy was good or that guy. Everybody has good and bad to them. All of us do. But boy, they're taking our history and they're really destroying it right now, and it upsets me a lot. It really does. I'm patriotic, but I also realize that even people that I don't agree with, that's part of history, there was a function there. They served a role, and we can look at them and say, hey, we don't want to be that way, or that was a good deal. But to just destroy it, and when I heard them talking about destroying Mount Rushmore, they'd do it over my dead body, because I'm sorry, I love history. I love our country.
Well, I think a lot of us do. Were there any specific challenges to getting this book published?
I get good question, because probably my biggest challenge was one that other authors don't really know anything about. When I retired from the FBI in 1999, I signed a lot of documents. One of them said that if I were ever to write any book or anything about the FBI, I had to have it approved by them. And they have a special unit called the pre-publication unit. And they're mandated by law to look at your manuscript and decide within 30 days whether they approve it or they don't approve it. Well, a year later, they were still sitting on mine, and I would call and I would get runarounds and asking why. And I guess maybe I thought, well, then I started thinking, well, maybe it's because I wasn't that complimentary all the time toward management in the book. I referred to them as FBI management as a gang of pretenders with a wolf pack mentality, and maybe they didn't like that. I don't know. But anyway, I guess my book being fiction, it was way too truthful, I guess, because they kept that. And finally, though, in the end, I have to compliment the unit chief. He himself called me, and he said he had read the manuscript himself after others had, and he complimented the manuscript, and then he wanted to know which actor I was going to get to play the role of Agent McQuaid, which is the star of the film in the Netflix series. So I thought that was kind of a compliment. He researched them and found that a lot of the things were factual, and even though it's fiction. So.
Well, the names have been changed. I mean, Joe Friday's got his thumbprint on this.
Well, yeah, I changed names just to protect the innocent and the guilty. And in this day and age, the guilty might be the ones to sue you. So anyway, yeah, it was written as fiction. Mm-hmm.
Well, Wade, do you have another book in the works? It sounds like you should write a book about being a driver's ed teacher, but
yeah. Well, yeah. Anyway, I have another book, I guess, and it's in my head right now. I guess, I mentioned this book was about a fictional agent by the name of McQuaid. He's the main character. He starts out in the middle of Indian Wars in the panhandle of Nebraska, the death of Raymond Yellow Thunder, which basically excited this group called the American Indian Movement, and they descended upon the little town of Gordon, and there were some pretty scary situations that Agent McQuaid found himself in with some others, and this went on to the takeover of Fort Robinson, Nebraska, where that's the old fort where Chief Crazy Horse was killed, and they tried to take over my hometown of Scotts Bluff, but thanks to some informant information, that went. We sort of stopped that in the middle of the night. There was, Agent McQuaid talks about and lived through the cold-blooded murder of some of his fellow agents on the Pine Ridge that he was working with, people that were killed by the American Indian Movement, those two agents. The book is quite humorous, and at times I tried to put a humorous spin, because you can Google things about the takeover of Wounded Knee, but you won't find the things that I have in my book, things from individuals that were there, myself included. The book talks about, the synopsis of the book would talk about sex trade, fraud, bank robberies, kidnappings, and it's all from the view of this lone agent working out in the middle of nowhere that does it all by himself. And where a lot of those cases, Justin, you'd have a whole squad working in Omaha. I kid you not. They would send 10 agents out, but when I was out there was nobody to send. So you'd grab a detective or somebody and do it yourself. And improvising, that was the way we did.
Well,
I go ahead.
You talk about Googling, but there's a real beauty in eyewitness accounts.
Oh, yeah.
Compared to somebody trying to decipher a part of history that they know nothing about.
Yeah, you're not going to find on Google agents at the roadblock at Wounded Knee that got so bored after 82 days that jump in the armored personnel carrier and fly down and do a quick Huey over the trench that those guys that they dug, those people that took the Indian movement that taken over the village. You don't find things like that. You don't find how they rang the bell with a rifle at a quarter of a mile away or whatever. You just don't read those things, and they're kind of humorous. But and you don't read about. So you look at the railroad trains going by, the freight trains hauling new cars. I'd like to feel that I was responsible for the fact that they're covered now, when in the old days they were exposed. I worked a case in a little town of Crawford where I cracked a case. We called it the Third Street Gang. Bunch of high school kids, Justin, and they were stealing. They would break into these cars that'd be sitting on the siding there in Crawford overnight, being transferred from the Chicago Northwestern to the Burlington route. And so come midnight, these kids would all go down there, crack open the wing window, get the keys to the trunk, empty the spare wheels out of the trunk. Every kid in town had new rubber on his car, and so basically we cracked that case, and I guess it was funny because where else would you find about 20% of the graduating class of senior boys convicted felons? And it was that was part of the life in the small town resident agency.
Was that Crawford's version of VOTEC?
That was Crawford, Nebraska. It was just a little town out there right next to Fort Robinson. It's a little dying town, very small, probably only 1,400 people. But those were the kind of cases. Worked with the railroad agents and the old sheriff, they're fun. I mean, you can read in detail about those in the book, But somewhere in the middle of all this stuff, Justin, I guess my boss thought I wasn't having enough to do, so he asked me if I wanted to go back to the behavioral science unit back at Quantico and study to be a criminal profile coordinator for the state of Nebraska. And I said, sure. So I was back there for 6 weeks, study. It was one of those things where else can you study under the masters? These were the guys that started the behavioral science unit, the Douglases, the Hazelwoods, the people that, and they were, day after day we sat and listened and learned from these guys and learned all sorts of new things. They talked to sex crimes, autoerotic deaths, all of these things that were pretty new to most of us. And most of all, they tried to teach us how to get inside the criminal mind so that we could be more useful to local law enforcement and helping with some of these cases that we were to coordinate with and helping with the profiling. So basically, the book goes on. It ends pretty much in Idaho, where parts of Idaho are still the Wild West, Justin. I don't know if you've ever been out to our great state, but we had a few county sheriffs back at that time that thought the county was my county, and they thought the FBI should have no access to their county, nor should state police or anyone else. So we had some real run-ins. There was a showdown on the street of a county right next to us where we had the sheriff's deputy, chief deputy, and all of his henchmen, and we were squared off underneath the street light in the middle of the night because he was trying to protect a bunch of thugs. His buddies were stealing trucks. They were part of a stolen truck and tractor ring, and so things like that were interesting. It was kind of like stuff you'd expect to see down in Tombstone, places like this in the old days. Where, it was crazy, and if I look back at it now, I kind of count my blessings that I'm still alive. But so those things are in the book. Where else could you find a county? I'll tell about the county later. One of the other things that I can bring up later if I have time. But go ahead.
Well,
I've rambled long enough here.
Well, it's fascinating. Wade, it's simply fascinating. And what would you like to leave us with? I'm anxious for this to be over, only for the reason I can get to Amazon and order a copy, and it is on
Okay.
Amazon.
Yeah.
And let's remind everybody that the title of the book is Hoover's Nightmare, and that'll be enough to find it. It's about a special agent gone native in Nebraska, Idaho, wherever he was, And there was another fascinating aspect he hasn't brought up, but it seems like in lots of the offices that Wade worked in, he was the one to turn the lights off. And what I mean by that is, when he left that office, they closed it down.
I guess that can be taken in a number of ways.
It absolutely can.
I cleaned it up. I cleaned up the town and
Yeah,
left town.
You left town. Okay. Wade, what would you like to leave us with today?
Well, like I say, it's been a great experience writing the book. It's been fun talking to you about it. I feel that you're a patriot and a friend, and hey, I hope to meet you someday so we can autograph the book. But I guess I'd like to leave people with the idea that I picked up from the behavioral science. One of my class counselors there said, never go home at night at the end of the day and make your family any less happy than they were before you got there. And then he pointed out, hey, remember, guys, elevators smell differently to very short people. Crowded elevators, I should say, smell different to very short people. So I'd like to encourage everybody to keep a positive outlook. The story that people tell about themselves is the story that they live. Whatever story you tell is the story you live. And I know that's true because I lived this story. I lived the story of Hoover's Nightmare, and I'd like to leave that with you. Thanks again.
Well, Wade, I want to thank you, particularly, first for writing the book, but also for your service to this country. A lot of people are motivated to do this type of work, but very few people answer that call. And to come out with your integrity and your dignity, I think is a wonderful testament to you. As I said, I'm anxious to read this book. So, with that, this has been Just in Case and Wade Shirley sharing a glimpse into Hoover's Nightmare, a special agent gone native. Thanks for joining us. Remember, additional information and links are provided in the videos. Read more. Please consider getting your copy via Amazon, plus stand back. We are not sure how big this YouTube channel is going to get. Thank you.
Thank you.